All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about recognizing and preventing identity-based attacks in Azure AD. Subject that's kind of near to me as far as my practice. My name is Tim Davis. I'm the subject matter expert for all things M365 and cloud with Now Micro. I have my MCSA certified security administration certificate through Microsoft. Certified in Office 365, MCSA as well. MCSE productivity expert certification through Microsoft. Also a member of the MN365 user group board. If you're familiar with us, you can find our events at mn365.org. We do quite a few monthly meeting every month. We also have 2 admin days that include multiple tracks per year. And those admin tracks are going to be things like security, automation, adoption, administration. So whoever you are, you could probably find some content that's relevant to your job and what you do at or your role at your institution or organization. Now Micro here, we are kind of a four-headed beast. We're a device lifecycle company. We also offer quite a bit in the way of consulting in the Microsoft stack, M365, your endpoint management, ConfigMan, Intune, identity management and productivity, which is kind of my area of expertise. We also offer managed services, so service desk, NOC services, SIEM and SOC, and security awareness training. And we also engineer purpose-built solutions both on the hardware and software side. I'm assuming most of you that are joined today are familiar with us, but if you do have any more questions, feel free to contact us. We'll reach out and see if there's anything we can do to help you out. And if you're looking to get involved, it's always fun to do presentations like this. Involved with the community. Getting involved with the community is really important. There's a great network, especially in Minnesota and Fargo and North Dakota. In this area, we have a lot of great tech resources, a lot of great community. There's the Minnesota System Center user group. Actually, all these are still around. I want to make sure I didn't have some that didn't exist anymore on there. Obviously, the tech community, like I mentioned before, the MN Office 365. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter, Now Micro, on LinkedIn. We also have a YouTube page where presentations like this end up. So if you're looking for additional content on other subjects, go right ahead and check out our YouTube page, like and subscribe, all that happy stuff. So what are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk about kind of the shift, to begin with, the shift between your legacy security, how it used to be shaped, what were our security perimeters in the past versus what they're shifting to in the modern day and age. We're going to look at some of the common attack vectors that we might see against those modern security planes. We're going to take a look at how we used to respond to threats versus how we need to shift our threat response and how we have to take a look at the threats coming in versus our actions and how those are looped and what signals we have to look at. And then we're going to take specifically a look at some of the attacks that we can see in Azure Active Directory. And then we're also going to take a look at the tools that Azure Active Directory offers us to protect your identities and your security. And then I'm going to go through some of the product breakdowns and demos at the end. So it's not just all me throwing PowerPoint slides at you. We can actually take a look at some of these tools and see what's going on. So what am I talking about when I refer to modern security concepts? So in our old world, we have our network-centric, where essentially our perimeter starts and ends with our firewall. So everything inside of our perimeter is accessible only if you're inside our network. We shut down access. Nobody can get in or out, access our applications or servers or workstations. That is the old network centric. And then as people became remote, we needed more B2B connections. We started adding things in like VPN connections, so our endpoints can talk to each other. Our Ohio office or our work from home person in Iowa can VPN and talk to their server in Minneapolis. And that became essentially our security perimeter. As we lift all or more and more of our workloads to the cloud, obviously we need something that's different, right? Office 365, Azure, Amazon Web Services, cloud apps like Salesforce and other SaaS apps. Those workloads no longer live in our network perimeter. Therefore, the keys to securing those become who you are and what you have. So your workstation, your identity being your credentials for your network, or your phone, your second factor of authentication. Those are our tools that have replaced the old model where the network was kind of the end all be all. So what are some of the common, so obviously as that shifted, right, we saw more people trying to exploit our firewalls, trying to breach our perimeter network security. That was the common attempt for attack vector. In the modern day, we're seeing more attacks against the identities themselves. And obviously there's some that are more popular, more effective than others. One being social engineering, social engineering being the obvious one, because that's usually the weakest link in our security are the end users, right? Social engineering, it would include phishing or spear phishing, phishing being wide-based campaigns where a malicious link or a man or bad URL is sent out, hopefully somebody clicks on it and provides their passwords on a bad website. Spear phishing attacks are more where somebody knows your organization's org structure and they're, say, sending a email message that is spoofed from the accounts payable to the CEO of the company asking for a wire transfer or asking for credentials. So they're more targeted. They're not a broad net. They're literally spear phishing. And then there's all sorts of host of other gift card and money wire scams out there. And then what we do, we see a lot of that. We get reports from our end users, but there are a lot of stuff that we don't really see necessarily get reported, but we can see the signals in Azure AD and our sign-in logs. A lot of those are what we consider password attacks. For example, brute force attack, where somebody is trying a whole bunch of passwords against a single account, hoping that they can maybe get a password that they've guessed, that type of thing. There's the password sprayer dictionary attack where if somebody were to have compromised your global address list and say they knew all of the contacts in your entire organization, they might try a list of passwords called the dictionary attack where, you know, it's Minnesota Wild 2022 or Go Vikings 2016, you know, that type of thing. And they're going to try and, you know, guess regionally what somebody's password might be. Try that against all of your users, hoping they get a click, and hoping they get a password that works. And it's actually, there are safeguards against this, and we'll go over some of those later. Some that are built in, some that you can configure yourself. But it's actually a pretty effective means. If you've ever seen the top 10 most commonly used password list, that's actually a thing. So that type of thing where people are using the very common passwords to go after it. And then there's credential stealing. So credential stealing is more of your attempt to extract the password through means that's more or less trickery. Man in the middle, credential finessing through, you know, scams like support, or they call and say, hey, we're with Microsoft here, we have this alert, or we're with Apple and we want you to authorize, or somebody authorize the purchase of a bunch of iPads or hardware. We need your credentials so we can stop this, blah, blah, blah. Man in the middle attacks are where you may join a network unprotected, sign into a site which you believe is legit, that may look exactly like the Office 365 login, but through network magic, they've redirected it to a site that is exploited. You enter your credentials into that site, they get recorded, and the bad actor who's running the network passes you off to the legitimate site. Just like that, you never know what happened, but now somebody out there has your credentials because you've entered it into a bad URL. And then there's a ton of other email-based scams that we can go over. Oh, by the way, if I mentioned, feel free. I think I did earlier, but go ahead if you have questions. Go ahead, throw them in the question and answer there. Caitlin is monitoring them, so she can throw something at me and stop me talking, and I will address them. So feel free to reach out. Or if you want me to expand on anything, let me know. I can also do that. So let's take take a look at what a typical attacker kill chain looks like. I've presented on this slide. I really love this slide because it kind of walks you through the mindset of your attacker, what they're really trying to do. They're trying to find that easy ingress point where they get a hold of your organization, some type of credential, something that's important, and they're really looking for that lateral move to some type of administrative credential. So your first step is typically recon. So you're looking for what's the easiest way in. That might be looking through org data, it might be looking through the website for an organization to find out who's who, who's an important target, who makes sense to target, social media, Active Directory user discovery, and then you get to the initial breach. So through any method of password spray, social engineering, however they get that, they essentially get that initial breach that allows them to dump the gal, and the gal being the global address list. So now they know they have maybe a user account that's compromised. So how can they leverage that to get some type of administrative account and then actually make changes, exfiltrate data, that type of thing. So essentially that they'll take out the gal, they're hoping that you have an account that says admin something on it, or obvious service accounts, or something that might have elevated privileges. So now they have your global address list. Now they're looking at all the accounts that might be privileged. Now they're going to start targeting those privileged accounts. That's what we call the elevation of privilege, the lateral move to an account that they can actually make rules and affect your organization. From there, once they've gotten that elevation of privilege, we'll look at rule injection, folder delegation. Rule injection being, let's say, if you're Pat, for example, I have an admin account and I set up a rule that all Pat's emails are also going to now come to me, or I'm going to take access or get access to Pat's mailbox, and I'm going to dump everything that Pat has into a PST file and go through it searchable so I can find something that I may be able to exploit that may lead me to money, or maybe lead me to access that I can use to extort money from your particular organization. And then exfiltration of data. So entrenchment is we want to get a hold. So even if they do discover that I've been there, that they might find that initial breach and close it, but I don't want them to know that I'm still in the system afterwards. Exfiltration is the smash and grab or taking of the actual data that they want. And so we can talk about attack planes like this all day long, right? But one thing I do want to talk about is the biggest attack plane in any organization is the end user, right? It's people that are busy, people that may feel, they're inconvenienced by a certain thing, or they just want it to go away so they can get back to their work. The end user is definitely where we want to focus the majority of our time and effort. So that would be education, training, and communication towards our end users. So security awareness trainings like M365 suite has attack simulations. KnowBe4 makes an excellent product. There are many other ones out there. All of them do an excellent job, but making sure you're communicating, you're developing that pattern where consistent communications are coming to your end users to make them aware of what IT is doing and your admins are doing. Very important. They're used to seeing it from the same email box with the same branding, and they're making them aware, and then actually following up with your end users, testing them on the things they've learned, making sure your training, your education, your communications are having an impact that make your end users more or less likely to fall victim to one of these types of attacks. There's no 100% effective technical solution to what is essentially a people problem, right? We can build our guards in here, but if we don't do anything to protect our end users by training them, a lot of this is all for naught, because somebody can give them the keys to the kingdom, even an administrator that maybe has administrative rights for something they do occasionally, and we gave them a little bit too much, but they don't know how valuable that account is and how much it can be used to exploit our organization. We really want to make sure that those people that have the keys to the kingdom are trained, understand, and are educated about how important that is. So we talk a lot too in IT security about reactive versus proactive, and Oh, we need to be proactive about this. We've been reactive for so long. Well, really, it's a combination of the two, in my opinion. It's not a fork in the road. There's not a proactive solution and a reactive solution. I believe there's different scenarios where reactive and proactive work together as kind of a security mesh, and you really need both of these solutions. Proactive meaning identity security, security awareness training, security and identity monitoring, penetration testing. Reactive being more like your static protections like firewalls, message hygiene, password protection, antivirus, anti-malware. So together, those things make up the net that you need for your security. It's not one or the other. So how do we modernize our threat response? So I like to implement something that's called the feedback loop. Hold on one sec here. I just want to make sure where I'm at with time. I'm probably talking too much. Oh, I'm doing all right. Okay, so our threat response is going to be, or the feedback loop is, we're constantly taking a look at what our signals are saying. What are we detecting for attacks? We're assessing them. We're planning a response for those attacks, and we're modifying our systems, and then we're implementing those modifications to protect against those attacks. But we're not done, right? It's a constant feedback loop. We're constantly looking at our systems. We're constantly looking at the type of attacks, and we're constantly adjusting to it, because the people that are attacking us are adjusting. They spend a lot of money, a lot of time. It's a billion-dollar business. Billions of dollars run through exploiting company, exfiltrating data. Obviously, in the news, you've heard of a lot of the cryptography malware that essentially holds a business hostage and all of their data. So they're constantly adapting their methods, and to really be effective against it, we also need to implement this feedback loop where we're looking for it. We're constantly adapting as well. So applying the feedback loop, and it's not just as a whole, we're essentially wanting to apply the feedback loop to each stage of that attack or kill chain. So recon, what can we do to prevent the recon, that initial breach? The initial breach being things like multi-factor authentication, being careful with the type of data we put on our website, the elevation of privilege, there again, using things like multi-factor authentication, privileged identity management, privileged access management, where we're only granting the amount of privileges for the admins that we absolutely need and not granting additionals. And we're having people build justifications for why they need that. And we're also maybe not granting that carte blanche. We're maybe granting that for a time period, maybe a 4-hour period where they complete a task and then it's automatically revoked. Entrenchment, we want alerting and a look and protections against people creating those types of rules that we talked about that may be forwarding our data or allowing people to entrench themselves in our systems. And then exfiltration, we need to know when a rule that is, or a large amount of data is being extracted from our tenant, or a large amount is being deleted. So at each place we have to apply these, not just to the whole attack or kill chain, but at every spot and every step, we got to make sure, because we might pick up the recon or the initial breach, but we don't want to miss the entrenchment or the exfiltration of data. So that's the overview of kind of the modern look into security, how it's changed over the last 10 years. Right now, I kind of want to go into more as far as what Azure AD can help us with some of those, or what tools we have within Azure AD that can help us with some of those things. All right, so one of the biggest places you can go, or one of the nicest places where you can get a lot of information about what's happening in your tenant, what types of attacks you may be seeing, are the Azure Active Directory sign-in logs. And we'll go through this. I'll show you how I use them. Very simple to sort by the type of protocol that's logging in, the IP address, the user, whether your security controls are being applied to the sign-in or not. It's used for identifying the password attacks and legacy authentication. We'll go through legacy. I'm hoping most of the people joined today are at least looking at shutting down legacy authentication. Microsoft has been threatening for a long time that protocols that aren't secure, like POP and IMAP and SMTP, will be eventually shut down because they bypass modern authentication. That was going to happen in 2020. It didn't because of obvious reasons. There was a whole lot more remote workers all of a sudden. They didn't want to disrupt a whole lot of things. But slowly they have been rolling out some of these changes to the tenants where some of those legacy protocols aren't able to connect. But you as an organization should be looking at shutting those off as well. And we can use the sign-in logs to find those scenarios so we can address them before we shut them off. We can also use the sign-in logs to find scenarios where a new rule or conditional access rule might affect people that are signing in currently. We may need to build an exception for a service account, that type of thing. It's also a useful forensic tool when you're like, something happened, somebody sent out a wire transfer, somebody accessed something they shouldn't or made something. The sign-in logs are a one-stop shop to find out how the hell this happened, right? It's where we go to figure out and put the pieces together. Identity protection are static rules set up against things like our users, our workloads, sign-ins, and risk detections. We'll go through this a little bit. It's a little bit more abstract, but it's essentially rules that are built off of the grading of the particular user behavior and their sign-in, or the workload that they're doing, or the actual detection of the risks. We can essentially set different actions on that sign-in based on that risk. And then Defender for Cloud. So things like risk level scoring. So going in and seeing the Defender for Cloud's actual bar where it makes it actually grades your risk level almost like secure score. The security recommendations within there, and then the heightened security alerts and higher level of alerting. So we're going to hop in our tenant here real quick. And we're going to take a look at the actual Azure AD sign-in logs. And I'm going to show you how I would go through and identify anomalous sign-ins using them. So sign-in logs, right here, we're in Azure Active Directory, portal.azure.com, Azure Active Directory, down here. And underneath monitoring, we have our sign-in logging. And we also have my picture, which is all right. Hopefully. See that okay? Okay, so each sign-in log, obviously the things that are displayed in our columns are pretty easy. We can see our user, what application they're using, the IP address that it's coming from, and then we can also see an approximate location. More importantly, what I want to point out is this client app. Here, it didn't take very long. We found an example of Bob, one of our owners, a failure, and I'm going to just go on a limb here and say that Bob is not currently in Amsterdam. Wait, is Bob in Amsterdam? Okay, okay. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that is a password spray attack. Somebody knows that Bob is an important person in our organization, and they're trying to gain access to it. They're also using SMTP. It's strange because there's not a whole lot you can pull from SMTP, but I think they're probing on a legacy protocol. Legacy being not using modern authentication is not beholden to MFA. It's not able to answer and negotiate a multi-factor authentication sign-in. So that's why IMAP and POP and SMTP are targeted, because they can get a pretty clear cut, this credential is good or this password's good. Luckily, this one's failed. We also have additional protections against that. We can also see one of our salesmen, Robert, here from, it looks like maybe Korea. I don't even know where that, yeah, I think it's Korea, right? Yep. We can look at what protections are conditional access rules. I don't know why that came back as not applicable. That shouldn't be the case, but we can see how our conditional access rules and rules that we've used to prevent some of these attacks have applied to a certain sign-in. We can also see if we put anything in report-only mode. We can see what type of device, what type of client was used, the actual failure that happened, additional details. So there's a ton of information here that we can forensically use to break down and find an attack, and then use that information to say, okay, hey, maybe we need a geo-blocking policy, right? Do we really need anybody signing in from overseas? Is the majority of our business or the majority of our users signing in from North America? Then it's possible we can just make a rule that says, no, you can't sign in from anywhere but North America. We can build that fence with conditional access. So sign-in logs are very effective in really going through, and also you can, after you implement your controls, you can go back to the sign-in logs or before you implement them to see how they might affect certain scenarios. For example, if I want to add a filter and filter basically on just the client app, I can build a filter here that will allow me to only look at legacy protocols. So IMAP, Exchange, Active Sync, other clients. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but POP, we already saw some SMTP, but a report just like this, which is easily exportable from here, is going to let us know where our scenarios and what which apps or accounts may be using some of these legacy protocols. These are all Exchange Active Sync. We need to have a talk about that.
Question.
Yes.
The tools you were demonstrating, do they require an Azure premium license?
Yes.
So which one?
Premium 1. So Azure Active Directory Basic, which comes with any tenant for free, does not include sign-in logging. If you get Azure Active Directory Premium 1, you do get the sign-in logging, and then some of the P2 features that we like identity protection we'll look at later. I'll try and call those out as I go along. But yes, this should be available with Azure AD P1 alone. All right. So when we're talking about protecting AD identities, what are our tools that we can actually use? So now we've looked at a way that we can detect some of these attacks and see them, which I'd encourage you to go in and see if you're getting any of those types of attacks. Now, what do we do about it, right? Well, there's things like conditional access. Conditional access from a high level, I'm hoping everybody's fairly familiar with it by now, but conditional access is scoping the requirements to access certain services, whether that be Exchange Online, SharePoint, any of your SaaS apps that you may be using Azure AD authentication for. What are we requiring, whether it be additional factor of authentication, SMS text message, a notification through the Azure authentication app? Are we requiring their devices to be trusted in order to access that? Are we requiring them to be in a specific network segment? Do they have to be in the office to access this particular SaaS app or this particular application? Do they have to be, that's pretty much it, in the country? That's a big one too. Do they have to be in the country? Do they have to be in a specific area? And then, for example, geo policies requiring MFA. On top of that, we have identity protection, which we'll take a look in a little bit. That's your user risk policies and your sign-on risk policies that we talked about. And then Defender for Cloud. So if you want to go that step further with the Azure Active Directory P2 license or the Defender for Cloud premium license, you get those additional security recommendations, as well as a lot better look into the reporting as well. So conditional access, in order to leverage conditional access, we need an Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or higher license. You will find this is included with your M365 A3, E3, G3, or up plans. If you are using E1, A3, or A1 or G1, or any combination of those, you would likely have to purchase Azure AD Premium ad hoc additionally. Controls conditions which the device and user can access. I always use, I say the thing for the next slide. I forget there's a slide in there, but this is what I was talking about as far as the M365 services, Azure AD enterprise applications. Scope being the who, what, where, and why of the situation. So who's our users that we want to be able to access this? What? We want them to be able to access it on a trusted device or an Intune compliance device, or we want them to answer an MFA. Where, network locations, geographic areas, and then when, how often users are prompted, and how long sessions may last. And there's some cool new templates. Actually, this is kind of why I wanted to go through conditional access. I know I presented on this before, but Microsoft has made some changes that allow people to quickly roll out some of these rules, and I kind of wanted to go through that as well. So let's take a look, and we're actually going to go into want to go into not this tenant. We want to go into the dev tenant because I don't want to show you guys all of our conditional access rules. Come on. There we go. Okay, so if we take a look at conditional access, let's say we want, where do we start with a new policy? Let's say we want to finally pull the trigger on blocking all of our legacy authentication. We want to get rid of those scenarios. The only authentication attempts that we want to come through into our tenant are ones that are going to be beholden to modern authentication and MFA. So I can create a new policy here. Oops, not right. Additional access. We can use the new policy from template button. So these are preview features. It's about 3 months old. I can come in here. I want to make an identities based off identities, but we can to make device policies. But for this example, we want it to be based on the people that are signing in. And we get this nice little screen here that has some templated policies that will roll them out. Require multi-factor authentication for admins. If you're not doing this already, you should be. Microsoft used, in lieu of this, previously Microsoft had what they called security defaults. It was a toggle button that essentially turned all of these rules on, and they thought this was the greatest thing ever. However, in practice, you may want to require multi-factor authentication for admins, but may not be ready to completely block legacy authentication. In these scenarios with these new templates, it allows you to roll these things out piece by piece. Everything here is a good idea. You should look at implementing it, but there's enough moving parts in it that you may, if you were just hit a radio button to turn them all on, you may end up blocking legitimate authentications. You may end up disrupting business, that type of thing. So this allows us to kind of piecemeal it out and implement and do some of that planning and work so we're not interrupting production. So signing, securing security info registration. So if you are met with a conditional access rule, let's say you've never registered for MFA, you're a brand new user, I got my brand new computer, I got my credentials, I sign in from home. That sign in hits a conditional access rule. That conditional access rule says you need multi-factor authentication, but I'm brand new. I've never set up my phone. I've never set up my Azure token. What happens then? Well, in the scenario, usually that user is prompted to complete the registration of their MFA token or their SMS immediately. The problem with that is if somebody were to somehow get that credentials and they're in a foreign country and they have the user credentials, that user would be prompted and they could set up their own phone in whatever country they are as a second factor and be allowed access. So the second policy here is securing security info registration, saying that when you register for your multi-factor authentication, we're only going to allow you to do it from this IP range or this network location or from this type of device. So that was one that was requested. It wasn't part of the security default setting originally, but it's been updated. Blocking legacy authentication is obvious. We talked about that a little bit. It's blocking your IMAP, POP, SMTP, those ones that aren't beholden to modern authentication. Then we have the easy switch for require multi-factor authentication for all users. There's more planning to this, obviously. Communication, when we do this, we want to make sure everybody knows this change is coming. We don't want them to be essentially prompted at once to register their MFA. We want everybody to know. We also can do things like pre-registering the users. We can send out, before we enforce the multi-factor authentication, we're very easily could send out links to everybody for them to pre-enroll themselves, set up their phone, their Azure Active Directory token, their SMS, before we implement this rule. So I've helped quite a few organizations with this switchover, rolling it out to everybody. It's usually as long with a little bit of planning, a little bit of communication, you can really have a successful rollout. And then, yep, require manufacturer. So Azure management. Let's see, the require multi-factor and for guest access. So if you have guest access, say in your Teams environment, we can set out a rule that only scopes to the guest users. And when they come into, even though they're signing in against their tenant and their tenant may not have, it's more of the B2B scenarios. Their tenant may not require multi-factor authentication, but when they use their account against our tenant, they are required to use multi-factor authentication. This is basically set up for those scenarios where you have external users in a Teams chat or a Teams channel, and they're collaborating. So another organization has access to that team, which includes a SharePoint library, which has documents and such that we may want only people with multi-factor authentication, that extra level of verification in order to access it. And then require multi-factor authentication for risky sign-ins. We'll take a look at what that risky sign-in looks like in a little bit here, assuming I'm not completely running out of time. Oh, we're good. And then require password change for high-risk users. So that links back to the risky users, which I'm about to show you in a little bit here too. Any questions on conditional access? Anybody? Everybody bored with me yet? All right, so let's pop back into SharePoint here. Or not SharePoint, PowerPoint. So identity protection. So this is a P2 feature, right? This is your additional protection that you might have if you want to roll out with Azure Active Directory P2. P2 is going to be included in your E5, A5, G5 plans. So if you have one of those plans and you're not implementing this, let me know. We can work out some time to go through and get these features spun up. You have to be careful with these plans. I wouldn't go toggling buttons. We want to investigate. We want to use the sign-in logs. If we turn on some of these, want to make sure there aren't any scenarios we need to address before we turn them on, because we don't want to preclude or shut out legitimate sign-ons before we do that. So what is a user risk policy? It identifies and responds to user accounts that may have compromised credentials. It can be used to make sure, or to force that user to reset their password. Sign-in risk policies. So that's basically, when you talk about user risk versus sign-in risk, Azure AD, the security graph is looking at the signals on all of the user's activities as a whole and assigning that user a score, where the sign-in risk is taking a look at that particular sign-in, all the signals that are coming out, where it's coming from, the type of device, what country, scoring that to that particular login. So user versus an individual login, and we can affect the controls at both of those levels. I have this. Essentially, you can see here that there's a little matrix in here. Hopefully the people on the screen can see it a little bit better. I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but this is essentially just saying what features you're going to get with P1 and P2 and free as far as the risk policies and notifications. So you can see pretty much everything is with P2. You do get some security reporting with Azure AD P1, but not as much as you do with P2. And you do not get any of the notifications or weekly digest or MFA registration policies until you get into the Azure AD P2 level. I don't know why I included that chart. It's impossible for me to even see. I'm doing like the squint to see it. So let's take a look at identity protection and what that looks like. So once again, I'm in portal.azure.com and I've searched out Azure Identity Protection. There's other ways to navigate to it, but I find that that's just the easiest way, is just to search it. This is my developer tenant. You can see I have a fairly weak sauce identity secure score here, but this is E5. This is what we're talking about when we talk about that Defender for Cloud and the security score. When I take a look at my risky users, so the biggest thing right here, we have kind of an accompaniment to our sign-in logs, which are the risky user reports, risky workloads, and risky sign-ins. So this is telling us the signals that the Microsoft security graph is getting, and it's allowing us to analyze them just like our sign-in logs, but to a greater level. It's automatically, instead of where we're parsing that sign-in log report initially by ourselves through the filters, this is doing it for us and pulling all of the ones that we need to be concerned about forward and allowing us to make decisions on what our policies should be. All right. So let's take a look. I don't think we want to go through the reporting on each one of these, but I definitely want to take a look at, for example, risky sign-ins. We're not going to see any here since this is, I really should have populated this. I should have got a VPN to China and tried to sign in and fake some of these. But risky sign-ins are sign-in logs. Risky users will report a risky user log, so we can actually go in and see which users are having anomalous activities. Workloads identity is in preview, where you can see some of those workloads and automation and app consent grants that people might be granting in here. And then risk detections is kind of the whole thing. So no risk events are found in my developer tenant because, well, nobody signs into this one, and apparently nobody overseas cares about it yet. But let's say I found a whole bunch in here. So I found some risky users. One of my accounts is constantly being spammed, or I'm seeing attempts from somewhere. I can come in here and create a policy, a risky policy. So I could say, I want this to apply to all users, a specific group of individual or a specific group. I can also include users or groups from here. And I'm going to say if it's scored medium and above, I want to take this. So that user, all their activity, all their signals is getting a medium or above risk. I'm going to either block access, allow access, or require a password change. So these are the two controls we have within here, right? Above and beyond that, we could go into conditional access and make a policy that says user risk score force MFA, or user risk score make sure is high, make sure that that user is on only being able to sign in on a trusted device. We don't want them to be able to sign in from a hotel computer or someplace in Rwanda, right? And if we look at the sign-in risk policy, there again, same type of situation. The grade on that medium or high or higher above, we have the same type of actions we can apply. This just being the analysis of that particular sign-on versus the user's complete profile of sign-ons. Now that I'm hearing myself go through this, I thought it would be less abstract if I demoed it, but I think it's just as abstract. But all right, so let's take a look real quick at the next slide here. So what is the big, so we have our Azure AD, we've looked at our P2 features, our P1 features, what that gets us. What does Defender for Cloud get us? What's that additional stuff that we're looking at with the Defender P2 licensing, which comes with your A5, G5, or E5 licensing? So it's part of that. You can also buy it ad hoc through your Microsoft licensing if you just want the Defender for Cloud with the Defender suite. I believe it's also bundled with Defender for Endpoint. There's a whole bunch of Defender licensing, and it seems like the licensing is in flux. The important thing is if you do have A5, G5, or E5, it is included. But in Defender for Cloud, so the posture management, security posture is visibility to help you understand the current security situation, and then hardening guidance. So this is the secure cloud, secure score and recommendations that you've been seeing in Microsoft kind of on steroids. It's going to give you the additional features. It's going to go through your particular security signals and give you specific recommendations. Let's take a look at that. Microsoft Defender for Cloud, once again in the Azure portal. Come on, load it. Okay, here we go. So, it's going to go across not only our Azure subscriptions, but we can add in our Amazon Web Service accounts. We can apply this as well to any of our single sign-on apps that we may have for Azure AD. We can take a look at our security alerts. So higher, oh, okay. Well, it doesn't care about that. Security posture. Oh, the demo gods are getting me. I really don't have anything populated in here at the moment, but I was hoping we'd have a little bit better overview. You can also, another thing too, is if you use a SOC or a SIEM product that's collecting data from your on-premise firewalls and on-premise security, Microsoft Defender for Cloud can be a great place to upload those signals to, and a tool to parse that information alongside what might be happening in your additional M365 and Azure AD sign-in. So no subscriptions. I had this set up. Apologies. So you may have to go through a little bit later and take a look at this, but you can kind of get an idea of the different workloads that you have in here, the alerting, security recommendations. In here, we would see a list based on what's happening in your tenant, where you'd see the recommendations that Microsoft says, and if in order to prove your security hardening, we should take a look at doing this, this, and this. I think we are, let's see if I have. So that's kind of what I have. If anybody has any questions, hopefully I covered it. Normally I like it to be a little bit more interactive, but if you guys want to lead me down a path or anything, just let me know. Otherwise, appreciate you joining.